Now, every time you drive through Smithfield, do you ever wonder who actually put the Smith in the name? Tonight we have Robyn Heitman, who's giving us a talk entitled Mr. Smith of Smithfield, diving into the fascinating, multi-layered life of John Smith, the man who quite literally put Smithfield on the map. A builder, a baker, a merchant and a farmer. Recognising the value of the route between Adelaide and Gawler, he purchased land in 1845. I hope I'm not pulling your...
Oh, I think you're absolutely telling them all. I'm not just going.
Anyway, he developed the inn and stockyards at Smith's Creek, serving as the beloved publican to the Wheatsheaf Hotel. And then, of course, there is the matter of the elephant in the room. I mean, the barn. That'll be interesting to see what...
Absolutely, I have all the dough down on that one.
There's some great stuff there, so that'll be good. Okay, now this presentation is backed by Robyn's own colourful life and rich background in Australian history. Raised in Salisbury and eventually found her way to Flinders University, where she earned a BA in social science with a heavy focus on local history. Her varied careers include teaching and memorable stint in UK, where she volunteered as a St Paul's Cathedral guide for guiding school groups, while humorously dressed as the world's oldest Virgin Mary. So, I haven't seen photographs of that.
Oh, I've got one.
Excellent. And earned an honourable mention in the E.M. Fletcher Prize for Family Stories. Today, the writer, who also pens the name Tilly Baxter and Robyn's short woman, balances her historical research with gardening, crochet and helping out her local repair cafe. And in the final throes of her latest book, At the Hem of the Empire. But I would imagine she'll give us a little bit of a chat about that.
I will later.
So that's going to be exciting. So please give us a good warm welcome to Robyn Heitman.
Alright, so I'm here to talk about William John Smith, better known to you probably as John Smith, the founder of Smithfield. And I'm just going to ask before we start, how many of you have connections to Smithfield? Can you just stick your hand up? That's a pretty good turnout. And how many of you actually have connections to John Smith himself? Woohoo! Give us a woohoo! Okay, that's not too bad. I better watch my P's and Q's. Okay, so before we start, I would like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the traditional lands of the Gawler people, and I would like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Now tonight I'm going to present in two parts. I'm going to go through Smith's life before he settled in Smithfield, and then we'll stop for a little break, have a cup of tea, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about what happened after we got here. So on the way, I think you will encounter a few important people and perhaps be involved in some significant events. Okay. So, excellent. So, this is Glasgow at about the time of Smith's birth, and the earliest I can trace him is to his wedding, and that's because trying to trace a William John Smith in the archives is almost impossible. Other people feel that they may have got further than me, but that's as far as I've got. So this is Glasgow, and it was, as you can see, a fairly small medieval city. Now, when Smith was there, I believe he would have lived in this area here, because that is the church that he was married in. So that is one of the most built up areas in the city. Over the next 50 years, with the Industrial Revolution, the city became more and more overcrowded, till there were as many as 5 people living in every single room. And they called them single ends, and we would call them bed sets. There was no sanitation. These are medieval buildings. It was pretty dire. And as this was happening, the poverty was becoming worse and worse. So you can imagine that by the time of his wedding, Smith was ready to flit, as the Scots say, which is, of course, to leave, usually overnight without letting your landlord know. Okay, so William John Smith was born on the 25th of March 1807, and his wife Anne Nielsen on the 17th of October 1819. So there was 12 years between them. So by the time they were married, He was around 30 and she was about 19. And they were married by the Reverend Dr. Nathaniel Patterson at the St Andrews in the Square, which is a very impressive building. Oh, sorry, I should have gone to next slide. Sorry, there we go. There we go, the next slide. Sorry about that. So it's a very impressive building. It's actually a copy of St Martin's in the Field in London. And when it was built in Glasgow, about 50 years before the wedding, it was in a very up-and-coming area. But by the time the Smiths married, it had descended into poverty and was increasingly poor. And you can see this photograph here to the side is probably a really badly overpainted daguerreotype. I can't actually find where it originated. I think I may have stolen that from the History Team's website. But it is certainly of Smith and his wife, because one of my cousins has her nose. Okay, so next slide. Right. Dr. Nathaniel Patterson was a man of some substance. Now, he was the founder of the Free Church of Scotland after it split from the established Church of Scotland, and that would have happened a few years after the Smiths were married. But he was a very important man in Scottish history. He was also a really good friend of Sir Walter Scott. Now, Sir Walter Scott was a famous novelist and a poet, and he is almost credited with inventing the myth of Scotland as we know it. So he was the one we can blame for Braveheart and for Outlander and for all those ideas of men in kilts up in the Highlands. So he and Patterson were such good friends that Scott based one of his characters in his novel, Old Mortality, on Patterson's grandfather. So the Smiths would have been very, very proud to have had connections to both these men. 2 degrees of separation from Scott's pretty good. And also, the Reverend Patterson was an author himself. Next slide, please. Okay. So, Patterson wrote 3 books. 2 of them were religious texts, but the 3rd one was a book on gardening, which I believe is still available. It was so successful. It's both a practical book about how you can get a very small garden, the manse garden, to be productive and contribute to the household. But it's also a book of a great deal of humour. One of the things he talks about is employing boys. Now, he employed boys because they were cheap. He didn't have to pay an adult wage. But he said, boys are plagues. Something above what is usually denominated an urchin and beneath a varlet. So he had a sort of funny turn of phrase. But he did like his boys, not in that way, because he could train them up. And he said once he trained up his boy and he was old enough to go and get a proper job somewhere else, the boy's mother saw how that has set her son up, and the next boy would come along. So he said once you get a good boy, you never have to look for another. They all just come along after their mother or their cousin or whoever. So I cannot help but think that this was the book which inspired John Smith to want a productive garden or even a farm of his own. And that was something that he could not achieve as a baker in Glasgow. Next one, good. Less than a week after the Smiths' wedding, they arrived in London. Now that's an incredibly fast time to travel from Glasgow down to London. So they would have taken a packet steamer from the Clyde across to Liverpool, and that was probably 24 hours. And then they would have caught the Liverpool to Manchester Railway and then changed to the Birmingham line and gone down to London Euston Station. Now, that rail line was really, really early. We're talking 1838, and it had only been completed the very week before their wedding. So they were amongst the first people to travel that entire rail line uninterrupted. Now, before that, you would have had to take a stagecoach between the unfinished sections, or before even the railway existed, you would have to take the stagecoach the whole way, and that would have taken you 20 or more hours, and that's without stopping. So you would go from one stagecoach to the next stagecoach. On the train, it took 12 hours, and they went very quickly, 22.5 miles an hour. But it was an absolute revolution. So they would have been amongst the first people to do that. Now, once they got to London, they actually intended to go to Canada, but there were no ships going to Canada at that point. They probably would have been better off taking a ship from Liverpool, but they didn't know that. So they were in luck, because at St Catherine's Dock was the Bardaster, and she was supposed to have sailed a month or so earlier, but she'd been held back for repairs. Now, the Bardaster's home port was actually Sydney, and she was not an immigrant ship, she was a cargo vessel. So that meant that there were not very many passengers on board, and the ones that were on board were in very good accommodation compared to a lot of immigrants. Now, because she only had about 50 passengers, they left London in early October, and after a passage of 109 days, they arrived at Holdfast Bay in early January 1839. Now, on board, among those 50 passengers were some people who had a huge impact on Australia. There was Mr Chirnside, and he built Werribee just outside of Melbourne, the big mansion of Werribee. And there were also the Yates, who opened up Queensland to pastoralism. And I know we have in the audience a woman who is writing a book about them as we speak. Pop your hand up, Angela. So when she has that out, maybe she can come and give you a talk about them. So yeah, I've dropped you in it now. Okay, so I always want to put a brag here. When I first started researching this book a long time ago, this has been a very long time in the making, the Bardaster actually wasn't on any of the lists of immigrant ships because she was not an immigrant vessel, because she was not destined for South Australia, she was going on to Sydney. So I was the one that actually brought her to the attention of people, and she is now on the immigrant lists. Okay. When they arrived, they were not assisted migrants. So the Smiths had to support themselves right from the word go. And so they set themselves up as bakers, and their premises was in the west end of Hindley Street. So if you remember where the brewery was back in the day, it was around there. So it was on the southern side of the street, somewhere along there. Now, at the time, the colony was not self-sufficient in flour. We were growing enough wheat for it, but we didn't have the mills to grind it. So the flour was very expensive. And then when there was a famine in the eastern states and the flour was diverted there, it became even more expensive. And the public were not sympathetic. So a little bit of a problem with that. And they complained about the high prices that were being charged. Bakers were going out of business. So the Smiths had been here almost a year. They arrived in January, and in November of 1839, their first child was born. And it was a boy, and they named him James. Now that's rather unusual for a Scottish family. Usually they have a very set way of naming their children. First son is named John for his father, the second son named James for the wife's father, third son named for the father's father. So it's a bit unusual that not only was he born 14 months after the wedding and went on to have a child every 18 months like clockwork, but they named him James. So I feel that it's a very strong possibility that they may have lost a child earlier, whether she was pregnant when she got married or the baby was premature, but I feel that that is an indication that they had lost a child. Now, just as that baby was born, a ship arrived in Port Adelaide. So, this ship came from New Zealand, and it was called the New Zealander. And it arrived in Port Adelaide under a Captain Robyn. And it sailed from the Bay of Islands with an entirely Maori crew. The Maori, of course, were great seagoing people, and so they didn't worry then to jump on a new ship and learn the ropes, quite literally. So they were looking for prospective immigrants. Now, this was before the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi. So this was in January of 1840, and the treaty wasn't signed until the 6th of February that year. So at this point, New Zealand is not under any colonial rule. So they would have been flying what they call the United Tribes flag. So the tribes in New Zealand, in the Northern Island, had got together and decided that that flag with the red cross and the stars was going to be their flag, because if they were found on a ship with no flag, they would be considered pirates. So they had their own flag. Now, I'm pretty sure that the Smiths were on board when that ship left South Australia. There's no record of the ship's list or anything, but the time frames fit. The family says that James was only a very young child, only a few weeks old when they left, and they were certainly in New Zealand by May. So, on the way, the ship stopped at Kangaroo Island at Kingscote to take on hay for the horses and last-minute provisions. And there were two rather rough passengers on board, not the Smiths, they were not rough. And these two passengers took the ship's boat out, apparently for some fishing, and they helped themselves by fishing in the settlers' cottages and took some things. So the captain had to make reparations to the people, and when he was at sea, it was discovered there was a young stowaway on board, and his name, he said, was Allen. Now that would be his surname, Allen. And there was a sealer on the island by the name of James Allen, who had numerous relationships with a number of the Aboriginal women. So it's possible that this child is his child. Now, Captain Robyn was a very decent man, and the reason we know about this child is because he wrote to the Adelaide papers and said, I've got this young boy, he's probably, I would imagine, about 10 to 12 years old, and I'm looking for his family. And until they're found, he can stay with me. So he was a very good man. Okay, so the Smiths find themselves in a place called Korarika. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And it's now called Russell, which is much easier for me to say. And it's in the Bay of Islands in New Zealand. Now, at the time, it was the hellhole of the South Pacific. And that was because it wasn't under any colonial rule, and anything went. So it was full of prostitution and drunkenness, and all the ships in the world went there to reprovision. So ships from Chile, from the United States, from France, from England, all went there to stock up. And it wasn't just whalers and sealers, it was also navy ships. It really was the crossroads of the world. And at that time, the Maori were trading with all those ships that came in. They were trading food and also weapons. So the Maori had some of the best weapons in the world through that trade. And they were making a mopsa. They were doing very well. Now, under this Treaty of Waitangi, the British take over, and the town becomes under the protection of New South Wales. So it becomes under the protection of the penal colony. It's not really a free state like South Australia would have been, a free province. It was still very much under the penal colony. Now, the Smiths' house would have been somewhere here along the beach. So up here we have the little pa, the native village, which wasn't very popular. There was bigger ones elsewhere. And then down here we had the only stone house in the village, which was Mr. Polak's, and the rest of the houses were wood. Some of them would have been like flat packs that were built when they were arrived in the bottom of a ship, and a lot of them actually sat on whale bones. They used the whale vertebrae as the stumps to the houses. So that's Kararaka. Okay, next one. So in May of that year, 1840, a congregational minister by the wonderful name of Barzillai Quaife arrived in the bay. Now, he'd also been in Adelaide, and he was ministering to a really tiny congregation, probably only a dozen people, and John and Anne Smith were part of that congregation. So that was the first Presbyterian congregation in New Zealand. He actually had gone to New Zealand to publish a newspaper. And in that newspaper, he forgot he was under the rule of New South Wales and a penal colony, and he spoke up for Maori rights. And so he was shut down pretty quickly. But while he was open and running his newspaper, John and Anne, or John, took out an imprisonment. So he says in June of 1840 that he announces that in addition to baking, he's going to sell tea and coffee from his home. So basically, he owned a coffee shop. So I keep saying I'm going to go there and I'm going to open a coffee shop in Russell, and I'm going to say established 1840. Okay, so after they did that, the family started to do very well, and they eventually moved into just selling general merchandise as well as the tea and coffee, because being a baker back in that day was very hard work. You'd be up before dawn and you'd be kneading the dough, and there was very little mechanical help. So they moved into easier work as it came. So in September of 1840, something quite sad happens. Captain Robyn, who is the 8th son in a family of 9 sons, where all of his brothers have drowned at sea, all of them, he decides to give up sailing, and he decides that he will stay on his in a little house. Oh, sorry, next one. I'm talking about something about him next. So this is his island, and he built a little house here, Captain Robyn, for him and his wife and his children, and he was giving up sailing. But he couldn't quite give it up altogether. So he had a little sailing ship, a little boat that he was testing out. He'd actually had it built, and it overturned opposite his home in the bay, and he and an unnamed deckhand were drowned. Now, I believe that unnamed deckhand was the little Allen boy. Es left his wife Elizabeth with a baby girl, Askina, and a young child of probably about 10 years old named Gordon. So Elizabeth had to run the farm on her own while probate was being sorted. And probate was taking quite a long time at this point, because they had to sort out what land had been sold by the Maori before this Treaty of Waitangi and whether that was legal. So while she was waiting for that to happen, she employed a hard ex-convict man by the name of Thomas Bull, and a local Maori boy by the name of Makatu Wharatatara. In 1841, November 1841, so just over a year later, smoke was seen rising from the homestead on the island. So Russell, or Karaka, is just here from the mainland, not very far away. You can see the island from there. So of course, a rescue party was sent, and they discovered something really quite horrific. In the smoking ruins of the house was the dismembered body of Elizabeth, and the bodies of her daughter Askina, who was a toddler, and another toddler who had been staying with the family, who was the grandchild of Chief Rewa. Thomas Bull was later found under a blanket and he had been killed with a tomahawk. But Gordon and Makatu were nowhere to be seen. Visiting ships were searched, no culprit was apprehended. Now, John Smith, being an upstanding merchant in the town, was asked to be on the jury to discover what had happened. Now, this is the inquest jury. So again, at this time, inquests were decided by a jury of 12 men and a coroner. There was no forensics, there was no detective work. It was just, they would look at a scene and decide whether it was a criminal act or an act of God or whatever. So John Smith would have gone out to that fresh murder scene, still smoking, and he would have been a witness to the crimes. It must have been absolutely horrendous for him. His own children were the same age as those little girls. So the men rowed out to the island, and after they had inspected the scene, they were approached by a very agitated Maori warrior. Now, of course, they all thought that the murderer had returned to the scene of the crime, and so in a panic they ran back to the dinghy. But luckily, two of the jurymen recognised the Maori man as the uncle of the slain toddler, and he said that the Maori had apprehended the killer. Now, it appears that the whole relations between the two communities, European community and the Maori community, was on tenterhooks, because the Maori would have been expecting the Europeans to descend and take revenge, because that's what they would have done. If Maori blood had been spilt, it would have been quite acceptable for people to revenge that blood. So the Maoris had been expecting the Europeans to come and avenge them. The Europeans, on the other hand, thought that the Maori were starting to have a rebellion and that they were going to all be killed in their beds. So that both of those communities are on tenterhooks. It transpires that Makatu had killed Bull, because Bull was a bully and a hard man. And when he was discovered by Elizabeth, for some reason, Makatu had also murdered her, and then he killed the two little toddlers. He chased Gordon across the island and off of a cliff. So, what was going to happen next, everyone was really worried. I think we've missed one, so that's okay, that's me. That was me for not saying. So, how things were settled was that the Maori were told that if they took a bribe, basically, they were given some tobacco and some other things that they prized, and said, we'll look after it. The Europeans said, we'd look after it. And they said, okay, if that makes everything calm down, that's what was going to happen. So the Europeans took Makatu to Auckland, where he was tried, and he was the first person in New Zealand to be hung. Now, this still remains contentious. At the time, the Maori thought it was very cruel to keep Makatu alive for so long. Their traditions would have been that he would have been killed almost immediately while he was still feeling remorse. And keeping him alive for 6 months of the trial meant he'd started to get over what he'd done, and he didn't feel so bad about himself. The other thing that happened was, because Makatu was not born a British citizen, there should have been 6 Maori on the trial, on the jury, and that didn't happen. So even today, many see it as the beginning of an example of how the inequalities started between the Maori and the Europeans. Okay, next one. Right. So things remained on tenterhook between those two communities. And by the end of 1844, Maori unrest was coming to a head. A man named Honihiki Pokai had decided that the Maori rights under Queen Victoria were being ignored, and that he would no longer recognise the British flag. So he climbed up to the top of the hill at Kororka and he cut the flag down. Well, it was quickly re-erected, and he climbed up to the hill again, and this time he locked the sentry inside the sentry box and he cut the flag down again. Now, the British saw this not in a good light, so they sent reinforcements and they reinforced the flag. They built protective barriers and things around it and bunkers in the town, and they sent for the 96th Regiment who was stationed at Hobart. So things were escalating. A militia of local men was formed, and John Smith was part of that militia. All of the men in Kororka were expected to defend the town. Now they were trained under a man called Lieutenant Philpott, and he was known by the men as Toby because Philpott, Toby Jug, he was called Toby. And they were drilled using their own weapons. Now, Smith describes his weapon as a blunderbuss. Now at this point, a blunderbuss would have been about 200 years old, so I doubt it was a blunderbuss. I think that was just him having a bit of an exaggeration. I believe that the weapon was probably a muzzle-loading Brown Bess. Does anybody here know anything about weaponry? Because I'm really in the dark when it comes to this stuff. Yeah? Okay. If I make a mistake, you may correct me. So he had a muzzle-loading Brown Bess, which was army issue. But at this point, that was becoming a very old-fashioned weapon. So both sides, the Maori and the Europeans, were having their guns converted to percussion mechanisms. But John Smith wasn't. He still had to put the end in and hit it up and light it and fire it. A very long-winded process. This weapon was later gifted by him to the Manu Para Council, but in all the mergers and over the years, probably wasn't labelled as to its importance. It was just a rifle. It's been lost. Interestingly, Smith's sons, later down the track in the 1860s, were heavily involved in the volunteers, and I believe that he actually donated the land for the rifle range up behind Smithfield, and I think it's still going. You tell me if I'm wrong about that. Okay. On the 11th of March in 1845, the town was attacked. So the townspeople, not fighting, sheltered in that only stone building that I pointed out earlier. And it was also where they stored the gunpowder. After the flagpole was again cut, the military retreated and the town was evacuated. Now, John and Anne Smith were actually evacuated by Maori canoe onto one of the 4 ships that were in the harbour where all the Europeans were evacuated to. 15 minutes after the town was evacuated, that stone building that was protecting all the women and the children blew up. And 4 people were killed. It's amazing that not more were killed. Now, luckily for the Smiths, Anne had under her skirts the takings of the business, and later, in a lull in the fighting, John went ashore and organised with Captain McKeever of the US corvette St. Louis, who had remained neutral during the skirmish, to help him off with his furniture. And there's a page from a log book in the Kororka Museum that you can read that's what happened. So the refugees were then taken first to Auckland, and then the Smiths sailed on to Hobart. Lots of the refugees did not. They went back, but the Smiths decided that was it. They were out of there. And the ship that they went on should have been about a week and a half voyage. It actually ended up taking 3 because the ship was so overcrowded. And in September, of that year, another child was born. So Anne had been pregnant, and that was their first daughter. And she is actually recorded as being her birth certificate is recorded here at Port Gawler, but she was born in September in Hobart. So, return to South Australia. After spending a little more than 6 months in Hobart, the Smiths caught a ship called the Palmyra back to Adelaide. Now, the Palmyra had been fitted out especially for transport of horses, and they brought horses with them to sell, and that's how they set themselves back up when they arrived back in South Australia. I do not know how they spent their time in Hobart apart from the birth of Annie, Jane. It's a mystery. So they arrived back in South Australia on Christmas Eve of 1845. And again, they had to start work almost immediately. So they took up the licence of the Bird at Hand at Dry Creek, and they stayed there for about a year. Now, this is a drawing, This is a drawing of that inn. It was made in 1845, just before the Smiths took it on, and it's showing the Hunt Club that were meeting there. So you can see it's really a very small hamlet in what was then known as Montacute. So Montacute Road is named for that, and so it's out near the levels. So they stayed there for a year, and while they were there, they met Captain Charles Harvey Bagot. Now, Charles Harvey Bagot was a teetotaler, so it's interesting that they met him at the pub, but I suppose he may have stayed there, on the way to his property that was out near Kapunda. Now, Bagot had discovered copper on his land in 1842, along with his neighbour Dutton of Adelaide Station. Now, those two men decided to keep that a bit quiet, so they bought the land as wasteland for £1 per acre. Anyway, so that meant that the mine was not actually begun until 1844. So it was on Bagot's advice that John Smith bought land on the Northern Plains between Gawler and Jepps Cross, I suppose. And his intention was to provide an inn and accommodation for horses. Next one. So it was an extremely hot day when Smith and Thomas Hogarth set out with a party to inspect the land that was for sale on the Northern Adelaide Plains. Now remember, that land that was being sold by the South Australian Company, they'd not paid for that land, they'd just taken it. So I don't know how people managed to sell land that doesn't actually belong to them, but that was what happened back in the day. Now, as I said, it was a hot day. And in this time, it was before the idea of carrying water in canvas bags had been invented. So people would have had to carry water in barrels, which is rather cumbersome. And often people didn't carry enough water. And it was not unusual for people to suffer heat stroke and to die of dehydration in this hot summer that they were not used to. So this is a quote from Smith, and it's quoted in a number of different articles that you can see, generally not ascribed to anyone in particular, but I did find one that said John Smith said it, and it's very exciting to find his words, you know. That on arrival at the Little Para, he found it dry, and it was thereupon glad to exchange a pannikin of brandy for a like quantity of water. So there we are. Water was worth more than brandy if you're a thirsty man. In July of 1847, he purchased 3 sections at auction, announcing that he would erect forthwith a commodious roadside inn with stockyards and every requisite. So, true to his word, the Smith built a wayside inn which doubled as his family home. It was called the Smith's Creek Inn to start with. It was constructed of limestone rubble and was surrounded by a wide veranda. And each room had French doors that opened onto it, and originally the veranda had lattice work around it. And at this inn, they stabled horses. Now, it was quite normal for well-to-do people to stable horses at inns, so that when they decided to travel, they could just change their horses for the ones that were stabled, and they didn't need to stop. So the exchanges would be, the horses would be exchanged. And Smith would have stabled those people's horses ready for them to change over. He also watered bullock teams, and there could be as many as 100 different teams camping in the scrub at one time when they were bringing down the ore. Even though most of the ore went across to Port Wakefield, there would still be other transport that were coming down into Adelaide or going back up to the mines. He sold strong brown ale and provided hot meals. Now, in 1853, a meeting was held in this building, and Smith made a motion at this meeting that Munopara, the district of Munopara, or the 100 of Munopara, should become a district council. So it was in this building that Munopara District Council was first, the idea was first put forward. The next year, in 1854, Smith had a section of his land surveyed and made into a township. Now, this was because the proposed railway that was going to go through, and he thought that it would be a good idea to have a town that would be, he advertised, a serious rival to Gawler Town. So he had ambition. And it's interesting if you can see the streets. Sorry, next slide. If you can see the streets there, I don't know how well you know the streets of that original Smithfield section, but not very many of them are named for his family. We have Ann Street, which is named for his wife, Jane Street, which is possibly named for her mother. Sometimes she's called Jean and sometimes she's called Jane, but if you say Jane with a Scottish accent, it sounds like Jean. And then we have Hope Street and Anderson Walk, and I do not know why they are named that, and if anyone can enlighten me, I'd be very, very happy with that. We have Kirk Street, which is obviously for the church. The Scottish word for church is Kirk. And then we have Gardner Terrace and Moyer Streets, and they are named for two prominent Presbyterian ministers of the time. So he's sucking up a little bit. Okay. But the last two names I find very interesting, which is Charlotte Street and Augusta Street. Now, when he was a young man, there was a Princess Charlotte Augusta, and she died in childbirth. Now, she was sort of like the Princess Diana of her day. And so he's commemorated her over his family in these streets, which I find very interesting. Okay, next one. Okay, Smith, in the middle of the town, in Augusta Square, Smith donated the land for the building of a Presbyterian church. So that was going to be the centre of his community. And if you think about the church that he was married in, that was in the centre of the square. He's replicating that idea. Now, before its construction, the congregation met in a schoolroom. Now, the date is 1855. 54, 55. Now, the first official public school in Smithfield was built in 1877. So they've obviously had a schoolroom in the town before that, but we don't know where it was or who was running it. Okay, so the church was opened on the 26th of August in 1855, and it was designed by Daniel Garlick, whose father had a farm called Ewley, and that's where we get the name of Ewleyberry. And this photo was taken after a couple of fires in the late 1960s, and it was demolished soon after, so the church no longer exists. Okay, now I'm going to talk about the elephant. And the story of the elephant, I'm warning you, is a very sad one. In 1851, two elephants, aged 22 months, so they were just toddlers, elephants live as long as a person, arrived in Tasmania from Calcutta on the Royal Saxon. The female was exhibited at the racecourse, and the male was bought by Mr. Thomas for a very high sum, and he took it on a travelling show. So he went around all of Tasmania, Launceston, the whole place, showing this little baby elephant. And he was talking about taking it to the mainland. Now, we lose track of the elephant for a couple of years, but then in 1854, the elephant turns up at Bentley's menagerie at the Cremorne Gardens Hotel in Unley, on Unley Road. And that Cremorne Hotel, a reiteration of it, is still there on the spot. And the elephant was exhibited, and a little house was made especially for him, but they say at the time that he was growing so quickly that he was already outgrowing this little house. Now, in 1855, under the care of a man called Hassan Ali, who was an Indian man who understood elephants, he was exhibited at the Agricultural Fair, which is the precursor of the Royal Adelaide Show, I suppose. And he was exhibited in a tent, and he was also set to a walking race against a horse, and the elephant won. It went faster than the horse walking. And he was also then paraded through the streets with Ali wearing his lovely national costume, and he was then exhibited at a theatre. And despite all of this, he did not make enough money to cover his hay and his water. And Ali was not paid. So he took the owner to court, and that's how we know how much happened with this elephant. Now, soon after this, the elephant starts to become very mischievous. So he's, 6 or 7? And he starts reaching in through people's windows when they're open, and he takes the washing out of washing tubs and he puts it on his back. And one day, when he's too close to a work site, the workmen start to hit him with their shovels, and he picks up a trunk full of wet lime plaster and sprays the lot. Unfortunately, wet lime plaster is rather alkaline, and a couple of the men went temporarily blind. Serves them right, says I. But what happened then was the elephant had to be sold to pay for damages. So he was sold at auction to John Smith, who walked him from Unley to Smithfield. And according to Smith's oldest son, James, they called him Jumbo. Now, this is 40 years before the Barnum Bailey elephant of the same name. So they are first, as far as I know, with Jumbo, an elephant called Jumbo. Now, they turned a horse collar upside down and used him to plough. Now, if you look at this picture, which is of an Indian elephant, obviously not at Smithfield, it's in India, you can see the collar, the same kind of idea. So all I can think of is that they must have had some advice from Hussein Ali, who knew about elephants, to have done that. And they tried him at the plough, but he was very slow. Then they tried him raising buckets from the deep well on the farm, but a bullocky said, my bullocks could do that faster. So he wasn't very good at that. And then they had him harrowing the fields, which is using a piece of equipment to sort of flatten the furrows after the ploughing's done and you've planted the crops and you flatten them out. And they found that suited him best. They fed him on hay and oats as they did the horses. So here's a painting done by James Shaw, and it belongs to the South Australian Art Gallery, but I believe it's not on show at the moment, but you can see it online, of the Smith homestead in 1862. Now, as you can see the Smith homestead here with the lattice work, and you can see on the right the original elephant barn. So that is the barn that the elephant would have lived in. The road here is the Main North Road, and then you see here two pieces of equipment. We see an abandoned plough, no animal in sight, and we see an abandoned harrow. And I can't help but think that the artist was making a bit of a nod to the elephant. Now, the elephant didn't really make his keep, and Smith was very much a man who thought that animals should pay their way. So he sold the elephant to Mr. Matthews of the Jeps Cross Hotel. And Matthews renamed him Tommy, and that's the name he's known as fairly universally in South Australia. He was set to work on building the stockade at Yatala, so the Yatala prison, and carrying sleepers for the railway. He was also fed beer. Now, elephants are really susceptible to alcohol. It affects them very badly. So the poor thing was mistreated. Not on purpose, it's just people were very ignorant. Finally, he was left out on a cold night, probably because he was getting too big to fit properly in any barn. And he caught pneumonia and he died. So elephants have the same lifespan as people, and this elephant was only 9. So he was really still just a baby. Now, I feel very bad for this. But this is the barn that was erected after 1862. So it never housed the elephant. Yep. Sorry. It was, however, built to the latest design. It had a manger running down the centre, and I believe that there was another one to the similar design built somewhere up in the Barossa, but I haven't been able to track that down. And it's all that's left of that original homestead of Smith Creek. The old home, as the home became known after it stopped being the pub, when Smith built the bigger pub down the road in Smithfield that still exists, it was called the old home. And you can see that the bottom photo was taken in the 1950s during its demolition. So you can see quite clearly that it was made of that limestone rubble. And you can see here to the right the half sunk-in old original cellar that would have served the pub. I'd love to get out there with a metal detector. Anyway, so there we are. Now, I bet you didn't know they went back to Scotland, but they did. In 1860, John Smith, his wife and their youngest baby, Marion, returned to Scotland, and it would have been for a year. 4 months there, 4 months back. No doubt they stayed for 4 months. They left 8 children at home. So the eldest son, James, was only 21, and the second youngest daughter, the littlest they left behind, was Jessie, and she was about 3. Annie Jane was probably about 15, and she would have probably taken on all the responsibilities for the household. Now, it doesn't mean that they were wealthy enough they would have had help. There would have probably been a cook and a housekeeper and so forth, but the family still was in charge. The children were in charge. So, John Smith and his wife travelled cabin back to Glasgow, and he went round the area south of Glasgow looking at stock. And when they returned, he had a veritable menagerie of animals. They returned on the Irene, and when they disembarked, they had sheep, poultry, fish, pigs, and a Clydesdale stallion entire, which meant that he still had his bits and was good for breeding. And the last thing, next thing, we can't go past mentioning John McKinley with everything that's been happening in Gawler around him. So it must have irked the Smiths that the McKinley expedition left from Paul's Hotel in Williston and not one of his. But he did manage to rub shoulders with the great man. On the 18th of March in 1865, McKinley attended a combined church picnic of the Smithfield and Gawler Presbyterian congregations. Now, he was a Scot, so no doubt he was a Presbyterian himself. Tell me if I'm wrong, I don't know. And that picnic was held on McCord's land by the Gawler River. 150 adults and 100 children attended. And they were served, the children were served a lunch of sandwiches, and a cold luncheon was served to the adults. And that was provided courtesy of Mr. Smith. So again, he would have been rubbing shoulders with the cream of the society he was in. Now, he died on the 11th of November, an auspicious date, 1877, after a long illness, 18 months to 2 years. And the shops on the main street of Gawler were closed for his funeral procession. So he was shown that respect by the local community. And this is his grave in the Williston Cemetery. It also holds his wife, Anne, and Jessie, his daughter, who died at the age of 16. There was another child that died, Mary. She died as a baby, and there's no record of where she was buried or even how long she lived. So in his will, by the time of his death, he'd amassed quite a portfolio. He held shares. He owned land in Manopara, Gawler, the Barossa and Urupa, and he was also the owner of 3 pubs. He owned the Smithfield Hotel, the Globe Hotel in Gawler, and a small wayside inn, the Gawler Belt Hotel on the Roseworthy Road. Now, he's often not mentioned in relation to these hotels because he wasn't the publican. He was the owner. So the publican he was the landlord, the publican would have rented the premises, and then when you see who owned the hotels, it's usually the publican who's listed the business owner, but he owned the bricks and mortar. Now, the only one of those, the Gawler Belt Hotel was demolished in around 1900 to make way for widening of the road or something, but the other 2 obviously still exist. After his death, next one. After his death, his widow continued to contribute where she could to the family portfolio. Now, his will is a rather controlling document, and his widow doesn't get the chance to become part of the estate. He leaves everything in trust, and she's allowed to have the proceeds, but she can't touch anything to do with it. And it's not a particularly fair document. The youngest son who farmed his land at Smithfield, William, was not left anything himself. He was left everything jointly with his other younger brother. And this was probably because when Smith died, William was unmarried, and he didn't think that he would continue the family line. Oh, how wrong he was. The minute Smith dies, William and Annie Jane both run off and get married. That will is really tied up, and Anne does her best to untangle it, and in her will, she leaves a portion of the land, instead of jointly to the 2 sons, she says, William can have the Smithfield farm, and Andrew, who he was joint with, can have the land at Manopara. But that meant that the land was severely reduced, and also Andrew already had a farm of his own. So William was completely stiffed as far as I can see, poor fella. But Anne was not taking any of this lying down. She also contributed to the community. So before Smith died, he told Smithfield community that he would give them land for an institute if they could raise the money to build the building. And he died, unfortunately, before that could happen. So his wife held the books of the institute, because the institute was set up as a public library and a meeting room. She had all the books in her house until they raised the money for the institute. And once they raised the money for the institute, she donated the land. She also managed to buy the Criterion Hotel here in Gawler. So that's the one that's just down by the railway station. I think it's still there. She paid £700 for it. And that was with the intention of leaving it to who she wanted to leave it to, because she had no way of leaving anything else. He'd stitched that all up so tightly. So this is an interesting thing, I think. She had 48 grandchildren when she passed. Yeah, you have 9 kids. They all have 9 kids. She decides that she's just going to leave that proceeds of that hotel to the ones named Anne or John. So that's what she did. And I have written a story about her called At the Hem of the Empire, which I spoke to you about last year, and I still haven't managed to get published, but it's coming out in the next month. I've got it at the printers as we speak. So if you want to read about the Smiths' exploits from Anne's point of view, please keep in touch and I'll let you know. I'm going to be selling it at the Salisbury Book Fair in July, hopefully. They haven't let me know if I've been accepted yet, but I'm definitely selling it at the Playford Book Fair in September. So I'll have that one out for you. And thank you very much for listening.
Now, do we have any questions for Robyn?
Yes.
Yes.
I'd like to say something about the elephant.
Do you want to stand up just so everyone else can hear
It's
you?
not very big, I suppose I better stand up. Now, I was a shearer, and there might be other men here that was a shearer, but I think I might be the oldest shearer alive that I saw in that shed.
In that shed that's there today, or the one that's demolished?
Okay. No, it wasn't in
that
the shed. It
would
was built in
be-
86.
Oh,
He's not that old.
That would be somewhere in the 60s.
Yeah.
And when that photo came out, I got the cutting in the bunyip. I haven't got it with me because I can't find it, but I've got it at
Oh,
home.
cool.
But I've got the photo of the elephant pulling a scarifier. And that's the only photo that I know of with a scarifier.
That would be fantastic if you could share
And
that.
That paddock there with the shed on it was, I think, it was owned by Byron McLaughlin. And Byron used to bring his stock down from the north, and that was his holding paddocks before they went to Jepp's Cross. And so Bill King was the manager of Tallunga,
Right.
Yattalunga, I mean.
Yattalunga.
But Bill was there that time and I saw in that shed. Now, Bill turned round. I go a little bit further than that, but Bill also was the manager of Yattalunga, and I had a good dog. And Bill was
back at the elephant bar. We're back at the elephant bar.
Bill was standing in the gateway of the catching pen.
Yes.
And my dog flew in the shed and up on their backs, and Bill went down. The dog put him down on the ground. Now, Bill, we had a laugh about that. Now, if anybody knew Bill King, that was part of my talk with the elephant.
Oh, wow.
You say you've got that image somewhere.
I've got the photo home of the elephant, which I cut out the bunyip.
And the
I'd have to have a
bunyip.
look for it in
We'll
my
have to have a
diary.
look for it in the bunyip then.
All right. What year? Is it after 1954? We'll have to wait until we get
It
the...
was after
bunyip.
1954. It goes back to, a bit later than that. Yeah, I'd say at least 10 years.
Okay.
But I would be able to find the photo.
Well, if you could, we would all be very interested in seeing that.
But the story with the elephant, I did not know what you brought forward. I did not know that there was 2 elephants. I did not know about the
original building.
young elephant, though. So that one in the photo would have been the young elephant, I think.
Yes.
I'll have to have a look, I'm not
Yeah,
that
we'll
old.
have a look.
We'll have a look.
We'll have a look.
All right.
Thanks
Sounds
very much for
fantastic.
listening.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you.
Do we have any other questions?
The building that's there now that we see as we're going by, just to clear up, was not the one that housed the elephant.
Sorry, no.
Okay, that's okay.
The elephant was sold. It was sold about 1856, and that building was built after 1862 because that was when the painting was done.
Yeah,
The elephant barn.
they didn't get that.
Well, it's in the, it replaced the elephant barn. It's on the same spot as the original elephant barn.
And I heard
It's a later version.
I heard there was more than one elephant there.
No, there was only one elephant.
They didn't get the story about it in the Bunyip, if I remember rightly, that the elephant was sold. I think they just
Yeah.
Yeah, well,
widened the story down a bit.
Yeah,
You know
yeah.
what I mean?
Yeah, and things become urban myths after a while. Like I have
Yeah.
read recently that the elephant killed 2 farmhands. Well, that didn't happen. There was an elephant in the United States that killed farmhands, and it was reported in the paper here. So people have read the elephant's killed a farmhand, haven't looked at where it happened, and assumed that it happened up here in Smithfield, but it didn't. It didn't. So yeah, so things become mythologised over the years.
Any other questions? All right, look, on behalf of the Gawler history, we have one more. Sorry. Yes.
Was there ever a hotel in Smithfield called the Wheat Shed?
Yes, the hotel was originally the Terminus Hotel because it was the railway, and then it was called the Wheat Shed, but it's had quite a number of names over the years. So I just call it the Smithfield Hotel because, and there was, a number of different hotels. Like there's an old spot in Gawler, and then there's the old spot down at the Salisbury. So some of the hotels, the names get repeated.
When you were talking about the streets in Smithfield being named after family members, you talked about Anderson Walk.
Yes.
That used to be called William Street.
Did it?
Yeah.
Ah, that's interesting. Because in the map it doesn't say that, and that was quite an early map.
We lived there.
Oh, it was William Street. Well, yeah, well, now we know that William at least got that name for him, the youngest son that didn't get the farm.
The Little Glory Baptist Church, which is on Anderson Walk.
Yes.
How long's that been there?
I don't know.
Ever since I've been born, I've known it's been there.
It probably was built at about the same time as the
When you
Presbyterian.
mentioned that church,
Yeah.
I thought that was what I was talking about.
No.
It was a Baptist church.
No, each of the congregations, because so many people came out here from all the different faiths, and that's the thing about South Australia, everybody could come here and worship the way they liked. They all built their own churches. So I think there's a place up in the Barossa that's got 3 Lutheran churches all in a row, each of a different complexion. It's just crazy.
Yes.
Yeah, I believe the hotel out on the Roseworthy side
Yes.
was where the Newton Livestock Company is now.
Oh, was it? Because I was not sure where it was.
Is that where the built-in was?
Yeah.
Yeah. And that was where the junction of the road to Freeling, the road to Roseworthy,
Yes.
and the road to Sheoak all converged at that corner.
Right. And that's why I was knocked down when they
And
were.
old Harold Williams used to live in it the last 9 years.
Oh, okay. That's fantastic. So this lady over here wanted to ask a question.
I don't know how many elephants would have been in Australia in the early 1900s, but it wouldn't have been the same one at the zoo, would it?
No, that would have been later. I believe these 2 elephants that came into Tasmania were the first, but it's really hard to know. They're advertised as being the first in the country, but that could have been the first in Tasmania. It's very hard to know, but they were fairly thin on the ground at that point. Later on, we got the elephants at the zoo that we remember, the Samoan, and I think there was one before her, but that was certainly around 1900. It was much later than this.
Okay. Any other questions?
Just on a personal note, was there a Smith clan in Scotland?
I don't know.
No, I'm just looking at your tartan.
Oh, no, this is just something I bought from the op shop. But I thought I'd come dressed in the part.
I was thinking it might have been sort of a dress up for the Smith family in Scotland.
No,
But,
unfortunately
no,
not.
no
And my
training?
husband is a carer, so I'd probably be more likely to wear the care tartan. Yes.
All right, look, thank you very much, everyone, for coming to this, and thank you very much, Robyn, for doing so. Now, on behalf of the Gawler History team and the guests, we'd like to give you a little...
Oh, look at this! Everyone's trying to make me fat. Thank you so much, that's fantastic.
No worries. So thank you very much for coming, and have a good night.